three different approaches to the infallible mind. The divided brain, so it's a bit of a neuroscientific take, some things on psychological development, and then something called the inability to mentalize, which is a series of clinical observations. So this is our brain, and it's divided for a reason. A lot of people know it's divided, but don't think about the reason. Our spleen doesn't seem to be divided. Not every organ, our stomach is not divided in this way. Not every organ appears to be symmetrical and divided. And the divided brain isn't about language being on one side and creativity on the other. That was a simplification that came out of the 60s. There's little bits of truth to it, but it's far too simplified. But there are actually some very, very significant differences between the two sides of the brain. And the person who put this together is Dr. Ian McGilchrist. He's a psychiatrist. He's an outstanding intellect. I mean, he was a great student of literature as well. And this is his book, The Master and His Emissary. Now, if you look at this is looking at the brain from below. So you don't usually do that, I understand, but if you were underneath a brain and you looked at it very carefully, in fact, you would find that it's broader at the right on the front and broader on the back at the left. So, it's only very grossly that it looks like the two hemispheres are identical. And inside, the connections are also quite different. So, for instance, the length of the connections between cells in the right hemisphere is much longer, and it goes deep into the emotional parts of the brain and reads a lot of what's going on in the body. And the left brain connections are short. It's like they're all talking to each other. Now, one of the ways to get at the very broad difference between the left hemisphere and the right, sometimes called the left brain and the right, is imagine a bird pecking for seeds among these stones and grit. So to eat, it's got to focus very narrowly on the little seed and pick it out against the background grit. Narrow focus. But it also has to keep a wide focus and keep on the lookout for new dangers or opportunities that might come on the scene, like predators, potential mates, or other food sources. So this is more like reality. One of those birds is pecking, but it's also aware that there's another comrade bird nearby. How does it do that? The narrow focus and the wide focus are actually handled by different hemispheres of the brain. Now, this is something very neat about a bird's brain. It's wired so that, let's say, the right eye is completely processed by the left hemisphere. So human beings aren't quite like that. So everything that comes in the window of the right eye is processed in the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere does all of that narrow focus work to identify the little bits of seed. You're going to have to trust me. This is going to be relevant to political correctness. It focuses on something it already knows is of importance. So this is a big thing about the left hemisphere. It focuses on what it already knows is important, seeds. And the right hemisphere, it takes the world in as a whole. So its window to the world is the bird's left eye. So it's vigilantly searching for novelty, what's not already known, a predator or perhaps a new mate. It's looking for something new that might be of importance, but who knows what that would be. So the right hemisphere's attention is open-minded and broad-minded because it doesn't quite know what it's looking for. And these things are going on at the same time through different eyes and different hemispheres. It's not just switching back and forth. Okay, that's a bird. What about humans? Our eyes are wired slightly differently, but the right hemisphere in humans is astoundingly similar. It sees holistically. So before things are digested into parts, it takes in the whole. It seeks novelty. It seeks out the unknown and new information. And because it's holistic, it sees everything in context. It has a sustained, broad, open alertness. It sees relationships. That's about context. And very important for our discussion today, it sees individuals. It sees, if you discover a human being and you see them as a unique individual in their wholeness, not in their parts, but how they all come together, that is a right brain function. It is not abstract at all. When you meet someone else who you never met for the first time, it's a unique experience. You're not generalizing from it yet. It is the seat of empathy. It's where we learn to read facial expressions and the emotions of others and our own emotions. And because it sees context, it sees humor. Lighten up. It understands metaphor. It perceives emotional subtlety and nuance. And the left hemisphere in humans, narrow, sharply focused attention to detail. It is actually tasked by the right hemisphere when something new and important is perceived to begin to map it in fine detail. And then its maps produce isolated parts more than relationships or context. Think of that book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, if you've ever taken that course, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. It identifies things by abstract labels, not context, and it works with categories of people. Categories, not individuals. So whenever people are overgeneralizing about people, it has a left hemisphere flavor. Language is interpreted differently on the left and the right. It's interpreted literally. It's humorless because there's no sense of context. It's abstract. It wrests things from their context. Abstract is from the Latin, draw away. So what do I mean? One of the things that the left hemisphere does when it makes this map of the world is it confuses the map with the world. We've all heard this, don't confuse the map with the territory. That's a really good left hemisphere thing to do. Now, where is all of this data coming from? It's coming from hundreds and hundreds of studies of patients with strokes who lose main right hemisphere function or left hemisphere function. Or we can use certain kinds of magnetic devices and apply it to the brain and shut down parts of the brain and see what the remaining hemisphere is like and then give them all sorts of cognitive tests. And we can actually inject anesthetic into certain arteries and shut down a whole hemisphere of the brain. So there's many, many ways that really thousands and thousands of scientists have gotten at this. So the map is felt, so when people have certain kinds of left hemispheric strokes, when they have certain kinds of right hemispheric strokes and they're left just with the left hemisphere, we can see how concrete people are about maps. Now, the problem with a good map is, as good as it is the world is always changing, and maps become quickly out of date. There's a few that may not come out of, go out of date quickly, like gravity seems to be what it's always been. But the left hemisphere is kind of like that person who, when lost on a car ride, says to his spouse, "We can't be lost. It's right here on the map. We're in the right place." And he says it over and over again, even though they're not. So it's got a kind of know-it-allism, a flavor of infallibility, if you will. Let me give you an example of a literal versus non-literal interpretation. Imagine I was visiting your home and I started to break out in a sweat and I said, it must be 90 degrees in here. Now, a literal interpretation would be Norman has made a statement, a meteorological statement about the temperature. A non-literal interpretation would be, Norman, would you like me to open the window now? That statement takes into account the context of my statement. Its relationship to me, the speaker, and to the overall environment. It requires indirect interpretation and empathy, and these are right hemispheric attributes. So here they are, the difference. On the left, isolated, no context, no relationship, sees categories, abstraction, generalization, tends to infallibility, rigid, maps are the reality. And I would suggest to you, when there's bigotry, it's coming out of this kind of move, plus many other things, ideology, emotion, etc. But from a cognitive point, this is part of it. And the right is holistic. It sees individuals. It wants new information. Okay. Now I'm going to link some of that up loosely with some things about developmental psychology that are relevant for political correctness. I'll tie it together. This is Jean Piaget, probably the greatest developmental psychologist who ever lived. And one of the things he tried to do was describe normal cognitive development. And he got a lot of it right. A lot of it holds up very well, even cross-culturally. There are some things, and I'm into the plastic brain, as you know, that can happen slightly differently in other places. But he made very, very broad observations after years and years of very fine detailed work. So here's some things he found out. There's an early cognitive stage from 2 to 7 where children don't understand logic and they have a lot of magical thinking. They have a limited sense that they have a mind that is perceiving the world from a particular point of view. In fact, some of them probably don't have any sense of that. And I'll go into that. And then there's this thing called centrism. They can only focus on one aspect of a situation at a time. And this is related to egocentrism, which is a kind of where do I fit in the world sort of concept. It's not just about selfishness. During this stage, their communication and thoughts are generally about themselves. Somewhat limited ability to see situations from another's point of view. They tend to assume that others see the world as they do. And some people can remain egocentric all their lives. And many, if not all of us, can, under great emotional pressure or physical illness, regress and show signs of egocentrism that we normally don't. Now, why are children egocentric? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. But one very simple reason that's hard to get out of your head once you get it in your head is this. Children at this age are quite cognitively focused on the external physical world, which can be observed, and what they can observe of the social world. But our internal mental states are not directly observable, period. So the young child rarely has a concept of mental states or the mind. This means there's a kind of mind blindness, limited awareness that other people have minds, and more importantly, there is a limited awareness that they themselves have an invisible mind that is interpreting reality. And each of you, try to remember that moment in your life, if you can, when you realized, actually, this is me processing all of this. I remember I was at nursery school, and I was looking, no divinity spoke to me at the time that I'm aware of. I was looking at some sticks. And I was just ripe, and I realized I'm looking at those sticks, and other people aren't seeing those sticks. And somehow or other, it's self-consciousness, self-awareness, and the awareness that I had a mind, and that therefore other people had minds, crystallized at that moment for me. And each of you probably had that experience. Do any of you remember that? Now, what happens if you're not aware that you have a mind that's processing everything? Your subjective experience of events seems like the only reality. You are not aware that your experience is just your take on events, that it might be a misinterpretation, a false belief, or a product of your experience. Interpretations are often centered on the self. Think of the child whose parents are getting divorced who thinks, it's my fault, it must be my fault. That's egocentrism. Now, we gradually grow out of it. The next stage, from 7 to 11, shows the beginning of new brain maturation. The child begins to use inductive logic, becomes aware of the existence of other minds. And this can often happen when they realize that you can fool people, that people can have false beliefs. And so Piaget did experiments on this. But for there to be a false belief means that there's got to be an internal mental process in the person who has the false belief that can be misled or mistaken, is somehow different, is processing events. And then development proceeds and abstract reasoning kicks in. Children can think logically. In language, they don't take everything literally. And children always love stories. But at this point in time, they can begin to analyze the literature and get much more deeply into the minds of the characters. So they're mentalizing, the ability to appreciate that one has a mind that interprets reality and that other people have such a mind. When you mentalize well, you don't even know you're doing it. It's automatic. It's unconscious. We realize, too, that we make inferences about reality all the time and are prone to error. We realize that the mental states of other people change rapidly, and the only sensible way to know what they are feeling is to inquire or to take a curious stance. If Socrates was the smartest man in ancient Greece, why did he spend all of his time talking to other people who were arguably his inferiors much of the time? It's because there's something motoric about thinking and learning, and that's why dialogue is a very important thing. So you can say, you know, I'd be pretty good in a totalitarian regime. I'm very independently minded. I would just keep my mouth shut, and if there was no freedom of speech, I'd never express myself. And that might work. And also, you might get very, very sick. You might get sick because it might be that if thinking is so important to you, then expressing it and interacting with people about it might just be the thing you need, the way, you know, some of us need to breathe air. So when we mentalize well, we can focus on others. We can form stable relationships. This is all the opposite of the infallible frame of mind. Now, I want to talk about the absence of mentalization in adults, not in kids. There are many situations where we lose awareness that we have a mind interpreting reality. As I said, high states of stress and emotion. And some people never develop the ability to mentalize in the first place. And some have mental illnesses that make it hard to mentalize or to think or imagine. If you're trapped in a very intense delusion, you are probably not mentalizing. One of the things we've learned a lot about mentalizing and its absence by studying the autistic spectrum. And for a number of autistic children, it's very, very difficult. You could be very high on the spectrum and have difficulty reading emotions and mentalizing other minds. In fact, the term mind blindness came out of the literature on autism. And children with autism are teased mercilessly, as you know. It's awful. And imagine what it's like for them not being able to understand other minds when kids are teasing them when they miss things. And then they will also misinterpret teasing or things that were very gentle remarks not meant to tease a child if you can't mentalize. So it's a terrible trap. There's another thing that happens where people arguably can mentalize but they don't, and that's in extreme forms of narcissism. So what the narcissist does is just imagine I'm a big narcissist. What I do is, and I'm dealing with you, I take all of my negative qualities and I attribute to them, to you rather. I keep all my good qualities, so now I'm very pure. But I don't stop there. Then I plagiarize all your special qualities and think they're mine. So if you're in a meeting with a narcissist, you come up with a great idea. He says, "What a great meeting. I can't believe I came up with that idea." Do you know? So imagine you're in a knowledge culture or in a situation where knowledge is important, or in an ethnic group where knowledge is important, and you can get a lot of narcissistic know-it-allism going on, right? People who never form close, secure attachments with others to help them read their feelings will have difficulty mentalizing. And there's a lot of psychiatric conditions where people have grown up without that input. There was nothing malign. The parents may have had difficulty reading emotions, but then the child has difficulty reading emotions and difficulty mentalizing. But you can see there are just many different causes of mentalizing. And so I've said that in autism, there's often a lot of right hemispheric damage. That helps to explain some of the mentalizing problems. But in very high trauma, in PTSD for instance, we now know that the right hemisphere, parts of it actually go offline. They stop processing. And remember, that's the hemisphere that helps you pay attention to novelty. So you're stuck in a trauma, you're reliving it over and over again. You're in a new situation, but you can't even notice the new situation. and a lot of your feelings and your cognition is cut down, and you can't even read emotion properly. We need to be able to read emotion to read minds. When we can't mentalize, our mental reality becomes the outer reality. They're equivalent. They're isomorphic. Our internal world has all the power of the external world, and all our thoughts feel real and as vivid as intense sensory experience. We can be terrified by our own mental experience, therefore. It's so vivid, and we lack the normal ways of reassuring ourselves, such as saying, I'm just imagining this, or it might not happen. That doesn't happen. It's all real. So our negative thoughts about ourselves and others feel totally unalterable. They're set in concrete. And remember, you don't have to be mentally ill to experience this kind of thing. Any of us can slip into non-mentalizing in extreme situations. And we become mind blind. How does that play out, though? We become intolerant of alternative perspectives. We are humorless. We are predisposed to massive generalizations and speak in absolute terms. Men are always, women are always. We understand language literally and often misunderstand nuance. And so we tend to misinterpret others. This is important because we can't read them. We see them as malevolent, and we start blaming and fault-finding, and we get angry. There's rigidity and external focus when you don't have an internal life. We're prone to all or nothing thinking. Our thought processes rigidify. We stick to the first explanation that occurs to us. Think about all the arguments you know, where someone makes a silly first explanation and then they dig into it. So there's a tendency to rigid quasi-infallibility and little awareness of how our behavior is impacting others. We're not mentalizing. This is really important now. Unable to perceive our internal states as internal, we focus on externals, such as school, government, the job, the neighbor, and what others say. And this causes a great problem for us. We become thin-skinned because when we're over-focused on externals and what others say, and we're unable to step back and reflect, our self-esteem regulation becomes a prisoner of what others think. When we don't mentalize, we become hyper-responsive to even the most benign criticism. We are trapped in what we perceive as their point of view about us, and critical words or disagreement can feel like violence because we're so sensitive, and that's why people say, you're invalidating my existence. So to summarize this psychological brain material, 4 things contribute to moving towards a state where we don't learn or recognize our other points of view and tend toward the infallible frame of mind. Regression to earlier states of functioning under pressure, a reliance on left brain categorization, generalization, taking things out of context. And I can tell you, I could teach a person to become left-brained. I could take any number of ideologies and train them to become left-brained and turn off their right brain functioning. Then we can have mind blindness for a variety of causes. And as a reminder, George Eliot showed, anger makes us feel divine justice is on our side. So all the wisdom of the gods is with us when we are angry. Now this is the final section of my talk. And these are ancient insights into justice and anger. As we've said, political correctness is focused on justice and compassion. And the ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Xenophon, Seneca, and so on, thought a lot about justice. But they didn't often speak about justice in and of itself. They saw it as one of 4 cardinal virtues. And the word for virtue in Greek is arete, and that means excellence. So it's something you cultivate. It's an excellence you cultivate. And the 4 cardinal virtues, when you look at how they talked about them, were often described or seen as interdependent. Cardinal comes from the Latin cardo, and it means that on which something turns or depends, like a hinge. And the idea is that a good life for the individual and the community depends on cultivating these virtues. And you have to do all of them. What are they? Justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage. And a virtue, a definition of a virtue, it's a way of behaving that's conducive to happiness over time. They have to be cultivated, and they have to be practiced. Vices are ways of behaving that are conducive to unhappiness, and they're also practiced. Now note, this is an important point. Compassion was not thought to be a virtue. It's only fairly recently, in some respects, that compassion was thought has become a virtue. For the ancients, compassion was a feeling, something available immediately, almost to anyone, to a child. Thus, it wasn't something that was cultivated. It was part of the raw material of being a human being. I'm aware that there are Eastern practices, there are compassion meditations. In the East, compassion was something that was treated like a virtue. So here's justice. Justice is a good thing, so it's understood as a virtue. So it would seem the more justice we have, the better, the more the merrier. And this indeed is the assumption of most social justice activism. How can you have too much of a good thing? The ancients were interested in balance, and they saw that the virtues do not stand each alone. And in fact, by themselves, they can actually and sometimes even be problematic. They observed that the practice of justice, for instance, without wisdom or moderation, often led to terrible consequences, even in the democracies. It's a painful truth. History's greatest crimes have been committed in the name of justice. In the name of justice, the Spanish Inquisition. In the name of justice, taking this man, an Anabaptist, and burning him alive for heresy. In the name of rights, our treasured human rights. In the name of the rights of man, the French Revolution's reign of terror. And this, ISIS. It's all about justice, according to them. So for the Greeks, justice by itself could spin out of control, and moderation was needed. This is a picture of Delphi, where our ancient writings tell us nothing in excess was inscribed. So moderation is needed for justice because justice is so closely related in practice to the wish to punish. It can be harsh, it can be vengeful. Even those of us nice people who restrain ourselves from unjust acts often feel a strong resentment towards lawbreakers and wish to get even. We say, he got away with it. Kind of implying we would have liked to have done it, but we held back. The wish to punish is the wish to hurt. And Socrates points this out in several dialogues very effectively. So justice must be tempered. And it's tempered by moderation and wisdom. And the Bible would argue by mercy. This is a side of it. Justice can become suddenly harsh in groups. And Freud pointed out that people in groups can readily regress and express terrible hostility. One of the things he said in group psychology and the analysis of the ego was in groups people delegate their conscience to their chosen leader of the time. And if the leader sanctions aggression, suddenly civilized people can rapidly become unbounded by conscience, and you can see the extraordinary aggression that can be lurking. Think of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just the sinners who sanctioned setting Jewish homes, synagogues, and people on fire, but the saints. And once a saint says kill, there's little stopping the crowd from becoming cruel, because in a way their conscience is permitting it. Now, you just saw private justice, Simpson style. Private justice is relevant today because of changes, I think, in the various tribunals and legal codes that we're seeing, which are privileging subjectivity. Private justice can escalate false claims. One key reason historically for having a public justice system was to put an end to private feuds and revenge bloodbaths when people took justice in their own hands. Of course, the original justice was people doing justice in their own hands. So private feuds, of course, are driven by each party's subjective sense they're offended and their non-systematic interpretation of events. And public justice, at its best, attempts to use more objective evidentiary criteria than private justice. But the PC justice tribunals, by reintroducing the subjective sense of grievance that Professor Peterson has spoken about as a criterion for human rights violations, actually, I would argue, returns us to the perils of private justice, but now with public approval and public imprimatur. So now, why is wisdom necessary? Wouldn't it be nice if those kids who are shutting everyone down actually went to university and said, I'd like to be wise? It would actually help their cause, because if you are not wise, you really cannot know what is right and wrong. And you may think it's an easy thing to tell all the time, but there's so many disputes about justice through the world that clearly people are having trouble sorting that out. And in Plato's Republic, which is also called On the Just, he begins it with Socrates asking people to define justice. People who are demanding it say, okay, tell me what you want. And none of them can define it. They all fall apart. I can't talk about it here today, but that's the brilliant beginning of Plato's Republic. And ultimately, he shows us that justice requires balance in the entire personality and in the city, and it relates to moderation and wisdom and courage. Now, why courage? Without courage, you can't stand up for what is just. And not everyone agrees on what outcome is just, though there is a fight. And entering that fight requires grit, and it entails risk. Now, I ask you to think of all the university administrators of our day who have caved in across North America and let one lecture after another be shut down without a fight, betraying their mission, their university mission, and their mission to their students. Sometimes they agree with shutting these things down, but I think more often it's a lack of courage and careerism mixed together. But physical courage is not enough to guarantee justice, because you need intellectual courage to have wisdom. Wisdom requires the willingness to undertake free inquiry and take apart and examine your own soothing fictions and beliefs, face human mortality, and your limits. Mill, who drew very much from Socrates, argued that free inquiry was the major basis, or one of the major bases for freedom of speech. So ultimately, the virtues are independent. Justice depends on courage, moderation, and wisdom depends on intellectual courage. For the ancients, politics is not the only way, and at times not even the best way to improve the world. The cultivation of your own virtue can have a great impact on others. What community would not be better off with people who cultivate wisdom, moderation, courage, and justice? So I'm moving to a summation now. These are our PC paradoxes. These are our goals on the left, and these are our methods on the right. Inclusiveness, a goal. Method, ostracism, firing opponents, demanding resignations. A goal, tolerance and diversity. Method, intolerance of diversity of opinion, as Obama noted. Openness. Method, closed to aspects of traditional society and religion and many other things. Kindness and compassion. Yet they demand punishment of opponents, even for unintentional discrimination, firing people, internet shaming, slander, and character assassination. Living together. Unfortunately, now on U.S. college campuses, there are a number of student groups who want to segregate themselves by ethnic group. Being non-judgmental and non-prejudiced, yet using the idea of privilege to condemn whole groups as guilty of an original sin by their birth. Whole groups called bigoted, sexist, violent, and judgmental of themselves, by the way, very judgmental of themselves, not just others. Finally, transparency, and yet the endorsement of anonymous complaints. History shows the higher, the more utopian the goal, the easier it becomes to justify barbarous ends to get there. The more unrealistic the goal, the more likely the failure, the greater the impatience, and the greater the need for scapegoats. The greatest evils in human history, in terms of innocents murdered, Mao's Cultural Revolution, the Soviet murder of its citizens, the Holocaust, were all done in the name of justice. You'll notice I haven't discussed ideology because Professor Peterson's going to talk about that. And there are many, many deep strands to enrich this discussion when looking at the narratives and what people are trying to do. But just in terms of the infallibility question, ideologies are belief systems based on myth, disguised as science or philosophy that overly simplify our complex world around one or two or several ideas. And because they fail to account for its complexity, they tend to become doctrinaire and posed as infallible when challenged. There is even an ideology-seeking temperament. Eric Hoffer, who wrote The True Believer, described a very interesting phenomenon, which is during Hitler's rise to power, when there were Nazis and communists on the street, and after the end of the Second World War, where there were still Nazis about and communists in Eastern Europe, people would often switch from being a communist to a Nazi or a Nazi to a communist, even though superficially these were very, very different ideologies that, hated each other. And one of the things that Hoffer was able to point out when he analyzed these people is they were fanatics. And fanatics were people who had a sense of self which they completely detested. So to say they had low self-esteem doesn't quite capture how hostile and angry they were to themselves. And what the ideology did to them is it didn't grow their self. They didn't want to grow that sick self. It obliterated their self. They wanted obliteration. And there are other people that I've seen over the years who show signs not of a terrible negative self so much as not having a strong sense of self at all. And they can turn to ideology which gives them the structure they feel they don't have internally. And if they're not mentalizing, it's very appealing. So some final words on forced speech. That triggered us getting together and talking to you today. Professor Peterson pointed out that there's a tangle of laws in Canada which, if taken together, can be read as allowing the government to, in effect, force people to say things they don't believe. And some people like to say, oh, that couldn't be possible, or it didn't happen. And Professor Peterson got 2 letters from U of T, well-lawyered letters, basically saying, you've got to change your position on forced speech. In other words, they read it the way he did. And he debated a professor of law who basically said, yes, it's possible that you could be called before the tribunal if you don't go along with saying words that we think are now mandated. And the head of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, when asked, well, is he in violation? She repeated the law. She didn't say, oh, no, that couldn't happen here in Ontario. And then the lawyers he consulted and others since. So there's free speech and there is forced speech. This is our charter. Section 2B grants everyone freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. Notice expression comes last. The first part is thought, belief, opinion. Expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. The rights are together because they're connected. Free expression is a necessity, a necessary condition for the free formation of thought and belief. And anyone who wants to argue that compelling a person to say things they don't believe in is not a violation of their freedom of thought, belief, and opinion seems to me to be very much stretching the charter. It's a case of government and the proponents of forced speech not trusting sufficiently in the goodness of most Canadians and the fact that they have diverse opinions and that we can benefit, as President Obama said, when opinions collide. It is a lapse into the infallible state of mind. But isn't it just a matter of etiquette? Isn't it good manners? Well, it might be if government didn't bring force into it. When's the last time you were forced to have good manners? Government can command many things by force, but they cannot command respect, even for others, with force. And respect is, I suggest, and I suspect, precisely what the people involved in this controversy really yearn for. So I think it's actually quite amazing that those who drafted this legislation have not summoned the creativity to find a solution to this problem that does not trample on other rights. But if you don't believe or don't agree with anything I've said so far, then I would say this. Always think of the next government. Breaking the taboo, endorsing forced speech, creating a taste or tolerance for it, habituating people to it as a legitimate tool of power, is handing your opponents a new tool, a shiny new tool, and governments change. And you will have taught your opponents that one can use force and get away with it. And especially if you represent a minority or marginal group, and I bet you that many of us, depending on how you dissect things out, can be seen as part of a minority or marginal group, it is far better to persuade people than force them. If you force the changes, they'll only stay in place as long as you or your side holds government. But if you persuade people, they will be on your side even when government changes. Forced speech is a robotic solution to a problem that is best solved with two-way empathy and understanding. And in the historical, clinical, and scientific literature I've read that studies people being forced to say things in families, in concentration camps, in unusual political situations, in that literature, which studies people who are not trusted to be good enough to find their own way and say what they think, we see these people led into a kind of hopeless apathy and despair. It leads to a kind of abdication of authenticity and even their moral development. So, I said that political correctness today is indeed mutually exclusive with freedom of speech. There's a tragic irony that the PC attack on free speech is that the tragic irony of the attack on free speech is that free speech is one of the most durable protections minorities and marginalized groups have ever had. And the shutdown and invalidation techniques undermine the very ideals they purport to defend and are based on the proponents claiming an infallible state of mind about what is compassionate, good, safe, and effective. In this kind of solution, nobody wins. Political, moral, and scientific progress, as well as our individual health, require a community that has a place for verbal argument. That's not violence. It's the sublimation of our differences into a verbal form far less vicious than true violence. So the very individuality that PC proponents treasure derives from liberty, which itself must be protected from two equally powerful human tendencies, that of authoritarianism and human know-it-allism. And I conclude my last slide with Mill's wisdom and his principles, that mankind are not infallible, that their truths, for the most part, are only half-truths, that unity of opinion, unless resulting from the fullest and freest comparison of opposite opinions, is not desirable, and diversity is not an evil, but a good, until mankind are much more capable than at present of recognizing all sides of the truth, are principles applicable to men's modes of action not less than their opinions. Thank you.